Okay, thank you everyone for being patient with us as we wait for more people to join. But I think we waited long enough, and it's a good time to start. So thank you for tuning into this much-needed conversation about creating safe green spaces in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic. Joining us are Professor Sarah Jensen Carr of Northeastern. Her current book in progress is The Topography of Wellness, Health and the American Urban Landscape. It examines landscape responses to six historical urban epidemics and the implication for current and future practice. I'm also honored to introduce Catherine Morris, the founder and executive director of the Boston Art and Music Soul Festival, or BAMSFest. I want to start by talking about our own quote unquote backyard that is the Emerald Necklace. In many ways, the creation of the necklace was a response to a public health crisis. So, this first question goes to Sarah, or these first two questions. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the necklace and Olmsted's vision? And our second question is, what other archetypes or paradigms of public parks and green spaces come to mind that emerged from public health concerns?
Um, Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Stephen, and the Emerald Necklace Conservancy for having me here today. Stephen's asked me to share some of the historical research that I've done on parks and public health, and also show some pictures of the development of Emerald Necklace. And I'm also going to show some slides today of Central Park, as I think it's important to know about its corollaries in New York. And so, Stephen, you asked by talking about how the necklace and really Olmsted's parks were a response to a public health crisis. And I think to understand that we have to realize what the conditions were in cities, especially on the East Coast, and in the early 1900s. And so they were very haphazard, right? There were, as we can see here, there are literally dead animals in the street. There were slaughterhouses existing next to schools. And there were piles of waste piling up because most people were responsible for their own waste disposal. And so if you think about Frederick Law Olmsted, he was coming up in those urban conditions. And what's interesting about his relationship to public health is that he actually started out as a public health officer for the Sanitary Commission of New York. He was at first conscribed to surveying soldier camps during the Civil War. So he would assess landscape conditions and plan camps to ensure the health of the soldiers. And in doing so, he would make sure that they were away from bad airs and stagnant waters so they would stay healthy to fight for the Union. But he was also, and we'll talk about sort of the more complicated aspects of his personality a little bit later, but he did very much believe in the democratization of public space. He was very troubled by what he saw as a trend of the elite going to nature resorts outside the city to improve their health. So respiratory diseases were also a large many people were afflicted by respiratory diseases because of the pollution in cities at this time. And so the elite could afford to leave the city and go to nature resorts in, say, Vermont or in Maine. But he wanted to ensure that those who could not escape the city, mostly the working class, would have a place to go. And so Central Park is one of the first places we see these ideals come into play. Many of us may think of Central Park as a sort of natural paradise in the middle of the city, but it is all, incredibly artificially constructed around this idea of public health that Olmsted had, and you can see Central Park under construction here, and then of course Central Park as we know it today. The interesting thing about Olmsted is, like, with that, on top of being a public health officer and a landscape architect, he was also a journalist, and so he left a lot of writings so we could, better understand his thinking about design. And so in here, he really was talking about having a place for the working class to go to escape the city. And he said parks would be a place to which people may easily go to after their day's work is done, where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, and feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets, where they shall, in effect, find the city put far away from them. Oops, sorry, having an issue with my slide advance here. There we go. Um, and he was also somewhat of a scientist, and he talked about sort of the mechanical use of green in the cities. And so he also said that air would be disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air by screening it. Opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and vitiated air of the commercial quarter, and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees and recently acted upon by sunlight, together with opportunity and inducement to escape from conditions requiring vigilance, wariness, and activity towards other men. And so what he was advocating for here was actually the mechanical aspects of the park, not just to provide health for people, but to clean the environment as well. And so when we get to Boston, what we see is very much a different context than Central Park. As most people watching this webinar probably know, Boston was primarily swampland at its founding. So here's the origins of the city. The area we know as the Back Bay Fens as part of the Emerald Necklace was actually where salt hay would be harvested for livestock that still lived in the city. And so as the Back Bay filled in and expanded, there was more pressure to make it a really aspirational neighborhood that wasn't just expressed in its building, but also grand green spaces like Commonwealth Avenue. Um, so when it came to building the park itself, though, ecologically, this is a much more complex site than Central Park, mainly because of the swampy origins of the city. And Olmsted's goals for much of the Emerald Necklace was to take advantage of tidal fluctuations to flush out sewage from the surrounding neighborhoods. At first, his design was not entirely popular because it failed to live up to the ideals of people that sort of expected another Central Park in Boston. An anonymous source to the Boston Globe decried the fens as a gigantic cesspool that emitted foul air and disease. But the Back Bay fence was always meant as more of a functional landscape than a scenic one, especially with its incorporation of the muddy river. And I think, we see a lot of his experimentation in the Emerald Necklace, but it became more formalized over time to sort of reach that pastoral idea of Central Park and some of the other parks we know Olmsted for today. And then even more so, through later interventions like Arthur Shercliffe's additions to the park. Olmsted was a journalist, and as I mentioned, he left a lot of writings with us, and so you know, I think he's rightly revered for a lot of his ideas about how public health, landscape, and democracy intersected. Talking about the intersection of public health and race in public parks today, we should also note that Olmsted was an outspoken abolitionist. And for more on that history, I would point people watching this webinar towards Sarah Zodi, who is a landscape architect and is doing work right now on Olmsted and his reporting trip through the South that was meant to expose conditions of slavery to people in the North. At the same time, for all his democratic ideas, he did have very highly specific ideas about the use of his parks. He wanted strict surveillance, no boisterous activity, no political speech, which will become relevant, I think, later in this conversation. He often looked down at the activities of the working class, and he hoped by putting them in the same space as the elite, it would civilize them. And so I think we could call this paternalistic at best or classist and racist at worst. He very much pushed for his parks to be built to also raise the real estate value of surrounding properties and pushing out existing neighborhoods. And he was also complicit in the removal of neighborhoods to build his park, most notably Seneca Village, which was a free Black neighborhood that was entirely raised for Central Park. But Stephen, you asked also, sort of what other archetypes and paradigms of public parks and green spaces come to mind that emerge from public health concerns. And Olmsted's contemporaries, most notably Daniel Burnham, the city planner and designer, the originator of the City Beautiful movement, the designer of Chicago, I think shares a lot of Olmsted's ideas, and I wrote a little bit about that in my book. So there were a few things going on when we think about the relationship of urban design and green spaces at this time and its relationship to health. So as cholera and yellow fever racked cities, that spurred the installation of wastewater infrastructure in many cities, and that required a major redesign and maintenance programs for streets. People in the United States often looked at European city planning, in particular Haussmann's plans for Paris, which was a huge influence on the plans of Chicago and Washington, D.C. But an interesting corollary to this is many have pointed to the relationship between physician William Harvey's discovery of the circulatory system and street design at this time. That is, just as Harvey found that blood circulation was powered by the heart and dependent on the flow of oxygen, palaces and places of commerce acted as sort of hearts that powered movement through the city. Grime was thought to clog healthy air through the city, and one-way streets were employed to maintain fast movement and mimic the directionality of veins and arteries. And so what I'm showing here is that, this discovery of veins and arteries and this thinking about injecting fresh air into the cities, we can really see play out in physical form from the plan of Chicago. This is another still from the plan of Chicago, this concentration on sort of wide green boulevards to push fresh air through the city. And we also see that kind of circulatory biological design in Olmsted's later plans as well. And here, this is a plan for Riverside, Illinois. And so if we think of streets as a circulatory system and civic and commercial institutions as hearts, and parks as lungs, and this is how they were literally referred to in a lot of the literature and the media. And so I think with that, that's my last slide. If you had other questions, Stephen.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, so just in thinking about these kinds of principles and ideas that were established in history of how public health has shaped the design of our parks, how do you foresee the pandemic shaping our relationship with our parks?
Well, I think there's two questions. Is what I hope will happen and what I think will happen is two very separate things. So I'm going to concentrate more on hope, I think, for this particular conversation. I don't think parks are going to be altered much permanently in the way of ensuring physical distancing. In many ways, park spaces are already flexible enough to allow a lot of that distancing, and we've seen that in the parks. We should also remember that someday there will be a vaccine. It seems a long way off from now, but it's probably relatively short, in the arc of public health history. I think what we have found through this pandemic is that we do take green spaces for granted. A large swath of the population has thought of them as an urban amenity rather than crucial public health infrastructure. And what we've seen is the importance of green space as a palliative, providing mental respite to deal with the anxiety of the virus or to recreate. And that, those principles were talked about when Olmsted designed his parks and his writings. So that's something that's actually carried through to today, that it completely aligns with the historical relationship between parks and health. But I think now we really need to go deeper than that and not just think of green as just good for its own sake. I think I've been guilty myself as a landscape architect that wants to see more parks in the city, of extolling the virtues of parks as a safe place in the time of pandemics. But that's obviously not true for people of color due to racism, policing, and even down to the very Eurocentric, pastoral, and colonial aesthetics of many of the American parks that we think of today. I think what this pandemic also brings up is this issue of allocation. What we've seen is there's not enough space given to green spaces, and it's not evenly distributed. And so I hope what the pandemic does do is highlight the parks as an equity issue for health and for people to recognize the importance of park for longer term issues than this pandemic, because parks are a way to improve our health in the face of many other long-lasting chronic issues such as climate change, mental health, and active recreation in all neighborhoods.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So this next question, Catherine, you're welcome to jump in on this one as well. But in thinking about Olmsted, I want to, hindsight's obviously 2020. So let's do a little bit of an experiment. If you could travel back to the mid 1800s and talked to Olmsted, what kind of suggestions would you make regarding his park design? In other words, what is your ideal emerald necklace or other related green space?
I just want to, can everyone hear me? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
One, I just need to thank you, Ms. Carr, because there's many interesting histories about Olmsted, and I've been trying to catch up to both the professional, but also the personal. So thank you for deepening that knowledge. You know, in not trying to make fun of myself, but I don't even think Olmsted would probably even talk to me, considering I might have been in the working class. And so to know that that is partly where his mindset was. If I were ever given the chance to have that conversation, and thinking about what it is today, I think the reality is that um, the initial design of a public park bring people together of various different backgrounds is essential, and that you know, not to take green space for granted, and to understand that every entry point to that park has a purpose. So I would like to know what that purpose is. Now, in understanding that Franklin Park as the example, there was no golf course, there was no zoo. It was literally open green space. So trying to imagine that then versus now is very interesting. But I think the ideals of not just entry points, but also the way in which things flow, right? So when I think about how the park was laid out, it's also where people lived, and it's totally changed now. It is a totally different set of generations that surround Franklin Park. So, you know, I think for me, it would be around the idea of beyond his own legacy, beyond his own death. How does this outlive who he is for future generations? Is what I would um, probably have a deeper conversation about, and just his exploration about really serving the elite versus trying to benefit everybody. I think that story is always complicated over time. Um, as for my idea, Emerald Necklace or Green Space, I mean, I love Franklin Park. It's an amazing space. I think for me, it lacks a lot of things. I think what I would love to see is a irrigation system that actually replenishes all of the trees and furbishes and shrubs in a way that's beneficial. It doesn't have the best irrigation across the whole park. And so some areas really do reflect poor uh, rerouting of water, but also where people are going to congregate and come together. I think the other thing for me with Emerald Necklace is that uh, or in terms of Franklin Park, is that it needs to be a space that really focuses on the balance of mind, body, and soul. It's great to walk, it's great to breathe, but when I think about world parks where they have different activities that keep the body moving, or there's different kinds of trees that are planted a certain way, you know, that give off more than others, or that there is signage that educates you about what's going on, or the different types of tree ecology around. We don't have that. I know we have the Emerald Necklace and we have the education experts around that, but in terms of if someone doesn't even know about Emerald Necklace, can they still walk into the park and be educated on their own in a self-guided way? We don't necessarily have that right now. Um, and I think more than anything, what's near dear to me, and God rest Elma Lewis, is that when I think about the Tanglewoods that have these amazing performance spaces that blend in with the natural landscape, we need to have that, because Franklin Park particularly lends itself to being a place where people can congregate and experience not just nature, but music and arts and activities that can still balance mind, body, and soul.
Yeah, I think That's the first thing I thought, Stephen. Also, when you asked what kind of suggestions we make to Olmsted, I don't think Olmsted would listen to me either. I'm Filipino. I don't think he even knew the country existed. So that's also the first thing that came to mind. I think, you know, in thinking about how the Emerald Necklace could change for the future, is mainly in two ways. Is one, we're dealing with very different climatic conditions now due to climate change, and that's the cause for a lot of the flooding, like Catherine mentioned. And so I think, you know, my ideal park is thinking about how do parks respond to that as a piece of green infrastructure that can also be used safely when we're not, you know, when we're not in the middle of climate events. And then also going off of what Catherine mentioned, I mean, the park was designed this way to be very self-contained, right? It was meant to be a refuge in the city. And I think now when we think of parks, we need to think of it as opening up to the neighborhoods, or, you know, how do we make those entryways? And it's interesting, you know, I just moved to Boston a couple years ago, and in my education as a landscape architect, the Emerald Necklace is always held up as a sort of canonical piece. It's perfect, right? That we always think of Olmsted, and the Emerald Necklace is a perfect piece of landscape architecture. And since I started researching the book, and since I moved here, obviously the reality is much more complicated. And so I actually, I have my students reimagine the Emerald Necklace each year in my studio. And I think it's so fascinating to see what they come up with, because they are the next generation. They're going to be dealing with the effects of climate change. They are dealing with issues of racial and social justice, and to see what they've come up with is really instructive for me. And so, you know, just going off the past semester, there's been ideas about having more water and irrigation in the parks, but more natural, so people can access it. Catherine would love this. Actually, one of my students did design an amphitheater, open air amphitheater for Franklin Park. So I'll have to send it to you after this conversation. But she did design a stage to sit on the pond. Yeah, and they all sort of mentioned, you know, signage, covered places for gathering, warming huts so people can use it more in the winter. And so, like I said, I think I've revered the Emerald Necklace so much in my head for years now, but I love seeing what my students come up with every year.
Thank you both very much. That said, are there existing parks or green spaces that we can look to today that kind of embody those ideals that we are looking for to model after for our future infrastructure?
I mean, it kind of feels like almost like a Pinterest question. Like I have there's just different things from different, not just parks, but like when I think about Atlanta, Georgia, where they have their botanical garden and how that's just set up and structured. I would love to see like a small adaptation somewhere inside Franklin Park, as an example, or any of the parks on Emerald Necklace, that really embodies the balance of nature and the different kinds of plant life that exists, because that allows for conversation, right? When I think about Tanglewood or Tanner Springs, how they use different kind of designs for pathways. You know, sometimes it's over water, sometimes it's over sand, sometimes it's over different kinds of dirt. Again, you know, with all those things playing together as a natural resource and a refuge, there's just different ways of integrating all of those things you know, along the Emerald Necklace. So for me, it's just different parts. I know that our weather is tough, but I feel a way in which it can be improved over the next couple of years, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I think what I'm most excited about going into the 21st century, and especially as we've seen travel patterns that have changed throughout the pandemics, is thinking about how infrastructure that will become eventually outmoded in the 21st century gets reused. And so, you know, one example I can think of is the Atlanta Beltline. So also in Atlanta, which is a rail that was converted into trails and sort of a linear park that runs through the city. Of course, the issue with all these sort of like great parks, really exciting parks that have been designed in the past decade, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, is the relationship to gentrification and how they're designed and who they welcome in. And so that said, I think we will have a lot of infrastructure that will need to be reused and rethought in the next century. And so I hope we can do that while thinking about the great public health challenges of the next century, which are, climate change, social equity, and now pandemics, which honestly is not something I had thought about up until a few months ago.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Sarah, because that's a perfect segue into the next topic I want to talk about. I don't think it is really out of line to say that our nation faces the much older and widespread public health crisis that is in racism. The fact is, even though Olmsted attempted to mimic the natural world, our green spaces are not like the wilderness where they were shaped by natural selection. Instead, people designed cities, which means they were designed for particular people, and that not everyone was taken into consideration. So one example that comes to mind is regarding discriminatory design are the urban heat islands resulting from redlining. So like according to a study conducted by the US Forest Service and the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, Dartmouth College, Bates College, Arizona State University, and the University of Vermont, there are 37 cities around the country, formerly redlined neighborhoods, have about half as many trees as the highest rated predominantly white neighborhoods on those maps. So this results in an average of almost 5-degree higher temperatures in redlined neighborhoods. And I know that doesn't really sound like much, but coupled with climate change, I feel like these differences will really result in serious health consequences down the line. So that said, can you talk about any other discriminatory practices inherent in urban planning and landscape architecture seen in our parks today? How do these practices relate to public health and climate? By the way, I will post a link to regarding those statistics that I just mentioned into the chat. But yeah.
Yeah, that study is interesting because I think, like you said, 5 degrees doesn't seem like much, but the fact that they are heat islands also exacerbates a lot of other health issues that are present in historically redlined neighborhoods, such as asthma. There was a study that came out from the University of California that also found that these historically redlined neighborhoods are often downwind from industrial polluters. And so sometimes the asthma rates in these, the Black neighborhoods are sometimes 3 times the rate as in other neighborhoods. And so that makes a huge difference. And as we also know now, air pollution and asthma are also preconditions for mortality for COVID-19. And so these things all sort of snowball over time. From a historical point of view, you asked about discriminatory practices inherent in urban planning and landscape architecture, and I would say they're everywhere, right? But they're everywhere in their erasure. And I was just reading an essay by G.G. Davis, who is a Black landscape architect in Detroit. She wrote an essay called "The Bottom: The Emergence and Erasure of Black American Urban Landscapes," and I'll put a link on here in a second. So she talks about Seneca Village. She talks about other neighborhoods that have been erased, and so we may not see them, but they're on the grounds, right? That these parks and green spaces have built on. But we also see it in the way that high traffic streets have been deployed to cut off communities of color from parks and other public spaces. We see it, I think, unfortunately, as educators and the sort of precedents that we push. And I was just having a conversation the other day with a colleague about a Black student that had come to him and saying that they felt they had to design in a white aesthetic. And neither of us really knew what that was, but it has. But we did know what it was, but we don't know specifically what it was. And so I think this is a time for us to really interrogate the precedents, right, from history to sort of the contemporary examples that we're showing from students. Again, thinking about hope and thinking about moving forward, I've really been inspired and learned from a manifesto that was recently published by an organization called Black Space that I think you can find at blackspace.org. And Stephen, I know you'll post a link to it at the end. That it's not so much about the design, but it's about strategies for designing with communities of color, and two of their tenets that I've really taken to heart is thinking about, one, choosing critical connections over critical mass, and this idea of building authentic relationships instead of going out to everybody, and also to plan with and design with. And so we as designers need to be conveners and not representatives of the design. And so thinking about these bottom-up processes.
Yeah, I wanted to add on that because I did see a comment. So when I think about Franklin Park, yes, there is a plan, which I'll share that link right now in the chat. So Franklin Park is up for improvement. And so there have been, at least pre-COVID, there has been 1 or 2 community conversations. And when I tell you, for anyone who's ever been to the Franklin Park Golf Course Clubhouse, try to imagine 300 to 500 people fitting in that thing. It's hot. But a lot of community people showed up because they wanted to be present about how Franklin Park should be improved. But what was very interesting was that the majority of people in that room were white. And what was even further interesting was that there was several emails that had circulated in the community about showing up. And I always wondered why a lot of communities of color don't show up. And I realized, at least for me, is that the education about Franklin Park and Olmsted is completely disconnected. No one talking about it. The way that Franklin Park has been interpreted through generation are for certain critical connections and activities, not necessarily the imagination of what it could do for communities of color. That's never been an option on the table to imagine. And so now here's an opportunity to do that, but not necessarily knowing what does that mean? Can those ideas go through? Who's going to represent that plan? And the folks leading it are white people. And it complicates the possibility of the vision manifesting to a point of benefit for the communities that surround it, have been there, have survived it, and are trying to stay there. So, to Sarah's point about the fact that urban planners and landscape architects, like my biggest challenge has always been come into the community, spend time, don't just organize meetings, go to coffee shops, go to churches, go to libraries, just see how people move. Watch body language, learn the cultural events that matter to that community that surround that green space, because then you can actually start to filter out the individuals and the organizations that might be most helpful to those designers about the design and structure and the flow of what that green space is supposed to mean. Like Franklin Park, as an example, is literally the largest urban green space for the multiple generations that have lived there. And the majority of them are people of color. But the folks that use it don't look like the very population we're trying to serve. And so I think, this master plan is going to be very interesting over the next couple of years, because now we have, there's almost like an assumption that how this money is spent, majority of it may not actually benefit the improvement. It may actually go to the golf course, which wasn't a part of the original plan. And that's very scary. Golf is for a specific group of people. It's still elite. it still fulfills a boys club. It doesn't necessarily, always welcome women. And we can go down that line in a different conversation. But for a park that's supposed to be 527 acres of green space, less than half of that is actually usable. So what does this improvement actually mean, and how much of the process are designers and planners willing to incorporate with community people and be willing to listen before they act, is my bigger question.
This is Karen. Sorry, I'm going to
Yeah,
turn off
sure.
the camera for a minute. I'm so glad that Stephen is organizing this. I did want to mention that actually the City of Boston did reach out and ask about potentially joining this, and I think we should have maybe another conversation where we can really dive into Franklin Park, because I'd really like to have a conversation about that, the bigger exciting possibilities for improving Franklin Park. There is just to zoom out, and the link to the Franklin Park Action Plan. Thank you, Catherine, for putting it in the chat. And we can also put that on our website and places for everyone to, I think we have, but we can do it again so it's more prominently available. So the City of Boston has, just for people's background, have put aside $28 million to spend in Franklin Park, which is a huge investment. It's wonderful. And I would say that's in addition to, there's a bunch of pathway work that's occurred over the last few years. So I think we've been seeing more investment. And I do think that there is, beyond Franklin Park, just in the larger practice of landscape architecture, I think there is a disconnect, in almost every case, between the folks that are in rooms deciding how things happen and then who those things are for. And and I will note, when I was in design school, there were maybe 2 people of color in my whole class. The profession of and I'm sure Sarah will be the first to mention it, the profession of landscape architecture is very, very white. It is usually very high income, and it also doesn't. There's a lot of reasons why it sort of stays that way, and I think that can happen, and that has happened. And I think I am right now optimistic about this plan, because I think this year the city did hire a team that went door to door and knocked on a lot of people's doors to come to the meeting, which not everyone can come to the meeting, so that's that isn't so ideal, but the room was too small. I don't think that people believed how good the outreach would be, and then there would be so many people. So I think now the question is, how can we make space for the next series of meetings, and how that should be done. And I think a lot of the challenge is the traditional model of coming up with a design, which is 3 meetings. You have 3 meetings. You're like, oh, what do you like? What do you like? And you have 3 meetings at the end. It doesn't really work for actual engagement. And so I think that we have to reinvent that model of how do you really do those things. So, and I think that there might be an opportunity to sort of get some good ideas, maybe here, and maybe this Zoom thing. I don't know, not everyone has computers. Not everybody wants to sit around and talk into a computer about what kind of park they want to have, right? That seems kind of divorced from open space. Maybe there are other ways to do that, to try and get more thoughts. Anyway, but I'm excited to hear that you think that might be a good conversation, because maybe we can have another conversation in July. I know that there's still outreach and meetings planned. I had also not heard that any of the funds would go towards the golf course, so that's definitely something that we'll pay attention to, because I know that there's always an interest in spreading things around. So thanks for the tip. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna leave now. But thanks for providing the link so everyone can get involved, because there's work to do on all these parks. Bye bye.
Thanks very much, Karen. Sarah, do you have anything to add before we move on there?
No, that's fine.
All right, awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about beyond. Now that we've talked a lot about Emerald Necklace and Franklin Park, there are obviously some principles that we can take from what we've learned from Emerald Necklace, and in envisioning the future necklaces, what are some locations we feel we should be placing these, looking into for the next necklaces, if that makes any sense. Like, what communities can we be serving in future park design and providing more green space?
I'll just quickly say it's interesting. As I mentioned, I just moved to Boston 2 years ago, and I actually moved here from Hawaii. And when Catherine's saying, what? Yeah, that's another I get that question a lot. But it's interesting because in Hawaii, they're actually planning a series of network green spaces that they're calling the Lei of Parks. And so that's the Hawaiian version of the Emerald Necklace. And so I think that just speaks to the relevance of the idea of the sort of networked green spaces. I think that's so that's all I would say about it. So I'm excited to see that happen in Hawaii.
I actually totally forgot your question, but what I feel like, at least, you know, being a Boston native, welcome. I feel like when I think about Blue Hill Avenue and all of the communities along that long stretch of an avenue, I feel like Mattapan is the last area that tends to be forgotten because the revenue is not there yet. I know that we fixed up some parks and things for kids, and that's great. And there's a beautiful bridge, and I'm like, is that it? I feel like when you're as gentrification unfortunately gets worse, there is going to be a shift and a migration where people start to literally go from the South End to Roxbury to Dorchester to Rosendale High Park. Mattapan will be the last stop, and then it's like Milton if you can afford it, and then we skip over to Stoughton, Randolph, Brockton, Taunton, New Bedford. So I think at this time, Mattapan for me needs some love. It really does need some love. There's a concentrated area still of a minority majority group of people who actually come from the Caribbean, who already have access to those things, who come from tropical places. And yet that's the last kind of refuge that's been provided to Mattapan, as an example. And it also has a lot of heat signatures. Same thing with Grove Hall. I know that there's an effort to try to build something across the Greater Grove Hall Library. There's an open lot to do seed bombing or things like that. But it's just, when I think about, people of color and how they're being displaced, but nature is one of their places of refuge, it's the one thing that's constantly denied, or it's so small that only a handful of people can go in at one at a time, or free groups of people at a time. So I feel like those are some of the neighborhoods that could be approached, and let that end up being a strategic model for parks and riverways outside of city limits.
Thanks very much, Catherine and Sarah. So I would like to now turn our attention to a little more on Catherine and BAMS Fest. The reason why I chose Catherine, one of the big reasons, is because of BAMS Fest, and let's talk about how parks can, and it really highlights how parks can celebrate culture and community. So BAMS Fest gives us a glimpse of the possibility green spaces offer in connecting people to culture. In particular, it provides Black and Brown audiences access to art that is really actually relevant to them. So Catherine, I think maybe now you can share your slides
Sure.
on BAMS Fest. And for all of you watching and listening out there, I'm going to post some links to the BAMS Fest website and their social and LinkedIn and all that, so you can check that out.
Great. Let's see. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. This is going to be really weird. I can't wait. Okay. Let's start from the beginning. So, for those that may not know, who BAMS Fest is, it's a arts and culture organization essentially founded in 2015 by myself to break down racial and social barriers to arts, music, and culture, specifically for artists and audiences of color across Greater Boston and now beyond. And now that we're in our 5th year, we've modified our mission a little bit to include that we do that through an annual festival, signature events, and strategic partnerships. And so our vision, ultimately, when all of our work is done, is to create a vibrant and inclusive arts and culture sector for the city of Boston and beyond that celebrates all artistic talents, challenges societal perceptions, and empowers and engages audiences. And so I wanted to highlight some of our milestones. We have hired and supported over 300 artists of color. That's including DJs, spoken word artists, musicians, dancers, visual artists, and comedians. We have been able to invest and support stipends for artists of about $85,000 since 2015. And that's in paid performances, creative services such as graphic design, photography, and public speaking engagements for artists of color. And combined with our festival for the last 2 years, 2018 and 2019, we've attracted over 8,500 attendees just in Boston and New England wide. And since we started in 2015, we have partnered with over 75 organizations and institutions, including the Esplanade Association, Arts Emerson, State Street, KPMG, the Boston Children's Museum, the MFA, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. So I just want to get into Bands Festival. It is a opportunity of a lifetime for me. I love festivals. I love what they can do for communities, especially those who don't always get access to the arts to celebrate their cultural heritage, but particularly for them to be outdoors so that people can experience nature if it's been denied to them or their generation. So Bands Festival debuted in June 2018 in Franklin Park Playstead Field. And I house it there for a couple of reasons. One, because of the cultural history of Playstead Field, specifically being a place where cultural events have happened basically for the last 40 to 50 years. Partly due to Elma Lewis, who started Playoffs in the Park, which still exists, with the Franklin Park Coalition, and the idea of activating that particular area for Black children and their families to experience live concerts in nature, essentially. So I wanted to pay homage to her and stand on her shoulders and do a 2.0 version at the epicenter of cultural events. And so when we debuted in 2018, we had over 2,200 people on the coldest day ever in June, if you can imagine. And it was an 8-hour event. And when I tell you it was a very monumental event because communities of color did not imagine, at least what we were hearing, that they deserved to have access to such an event inside Franklin Park. And that was very striking to me because I'd heard that when I was a kid, but to see it now as an adult, to hear it as an adult, there is still a stigma that they don't deserve to have access to this park because of its history. So here are just some photos of people who have come to our event. I mean, it spans the gamut, but everyone came. It was amazing. And then in 2019, we had it again. We grew from 2,200 people to 6,500 folks, and that's because of good weather, because that's a thing here in Boston. Still an 8-hour event, and we had 19 artists from all walks of life perform. The goal, the scale of this festival is very unique because we're not trying to stay at being a one day. We're trying to be a weekend festival that explores as many possible places in Franklin Park that allows for engagement with the arts, specifically that is presented by local artists of color. And the reason why that is important is because artists of color are often overlooked for opportunities to share their talent that is totally relevant and contributory to the city of Boston's culture and history and future narrative. So I wanted to be very specific about ensuring that if we're going to say we're going to support the arts, then let's do that holistically. And let's ensure that artists of color are being paid for their creative capital, while also being challenged to perform to an audience in elements that they can't control, but get to learn more about the park and its history and what it may have in terms of impact on their legacy, and in being confident in representing where they come from in terms of Boston. So our goal is to get to 20,000 people by 2029, and to go from a 1-day to a 3-day festival, at least 6 to 8 hours a day, representing all types of genres of music and different types of art. So that it becomes this walkable festival where there are moments of surprise no matter where you go along walkways, and also in terms of seeing all the different neighborhoods that Franklin Park connects. You know, the true representation, at least in my opinion, of Boston's culture. So again, these are some photos of folks who have attended Bands Festival last year. Again, it was amazing. And the next couple of slides, I just want to get into
Oh, Catherine, your audio just dropped out.
I can't see anybody.
Oh, you're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yep.
Okay, great. So since 2015, we've done over 20 shows to build momentum of the city and artists, to convey that they deserve to have access to arts that looks like them, represents their cultural and social needs and identities. So these photos I'm showing you are representing what those experiences have been like for us. Everything from panel discussions to conferences to workshops to smaller shows, you name it, we've done it. And so for us, in terms of actions that we've taken to support Afro-diasporic people, for us and for me personally, the equation is very simple. If you can support the personal development, the personal well-being, and the professional development of an artist, it equals an active citizen. And as long as they're informed about the places they have access to, they start to bring more people who start to learn they have access and privilege as well. And so it's everything from workshops that help them make the best life decisions, to make better informed decisions about their business, but also to be ambassadors of the city they want to be proud of and the spaces that support their development. So that's how we've been supporting artists over the last couple of years, everything from encouraging artists who may have stage fright to actually be put in front of an audience, or to be in front of thousands of people if they've never done it before. One, because we trust and we believe in them, but also the community has to see these artists for more than what they think they are, but that they're so much bigger than what they've even shown themselves so far. So I'm going to undo my slide, my presentation. But for anyone that wants to know, you can totally find us on social media at BandsFest, or visit us at bandsfest.org. And that's all I got.
Thanks so much, Catherine. It's really, really great to hear all the great work that's being done there. So one thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking about BAMSFest and the white and non-Black audience, being a festival that welcomes all people, how can the festival as a whole maintain a safe space for Black artists, free of toxicities such as like cultural appropriation and microaggression, that kind of stuff?
I think what's allowed Bands Festival to be successful is that all the curation, all the production, the lived experience that we imagine for Black and Brown people to have is curated by Black and Brown people. I think that for institutions that have tried, you have to let the folks who are representative, who have those lived experiences, curate them, because it's hard to communicate the innate or natural or cultural feelings and emotions that people of color go through if it's not curated by people that they can comfortable with. And so it has to start there, in my humble opinion. That's why we do what we do in a very specific way, because we want our communities to feel as if that they deserve access to as many things as possible, and that whatever they walk into, whether it's a door or a park or any kind of space, that the settings are going to be familiar, they're going to feel like home, there's not going to be any judgment, and if there is, we will address that and put that out of the room. For any Bands Festival event any Bands Fest event that we have done, There is always food. We hug people, we laugh, we break bread, because that is something that a lot of people may not even have. And if that is something that we can do, even if it's a stranger, it is what has allowed us to build so organically over the last 5 years. Anyone that has gone to a Bands Fest event can say, I support that event because I know what I'm getting in terms of quality that I deserve, that's often been denied from me by other institutions.
Yeah, that's definitely an ideal that I think we should all look up to and model after. So following this kind of culture of being welcoming and open, let's turn our attention to Christian Cooper. So on paper, Christian Cooper seems like my kind of nerd. He's a writer and editor for both science journals and comic books. He's also an avid birder. So what's not to like? I think parks should generally be considered a safe, democratic sanctuary for all people, but all too often, people in the park will have, like, with implicit bias, will perceive Black people as threats. In light of the unjust treatment of Christian Cooper in Central Park, it is clear that our parks are not safe for all people. Over the years, some people have developed a false and unwarranted perception of Franklin Park as a dangerous place. So that being said, how can we challenge our own implicit biases, particularly when green spaces such as Franklin Park have a historical perceived stigma associated with its existence?
That's always a loaded question. Implicit bias is an individual choice. It's an individual ignorance. And it's also, about being misinformed or uneducated about things you don't know. So across all institutions and allies that have said, educate yourself, yeah, that's the first step. It's an intrinsic choice that if you want to change your behavior, you first have to undo the bad to learn the good. And that's an individual choice. So for those that want to do better, be better, you have to know that your personal beliefs and upbringing of how you thought about the world are going to be challenged because it's supposed to be. And that's where it starts, and I think for me, when it comes to Franklin Park, there's plenty of descriptions of what Franklin Park is from a historical sense, but there's very few testimonies about what it actually has meant to people. And I think that actually might change people's perception about what this park has meant to them over generations, over decades. I would love to see that project happen because for some people, it is a refuge in terms of walking, in terms of health. For others, it's about seeing their son play a football game or a running track or a running cross country. For some, it's playing golf or whatever the case is, or just being able to walk across the street from your apartment or home to a place that, the further you walk in, the less you hear the city, which is absolutely magical. But I feel like we haven't got a collective narrative or understanding about what the park has meant to different generations. And I think if we're able to have that conversation, I think the stigma around Franklin Park actually might shift. For those who've ever been to Franklin Park on the Blue Hill Avenue side, I can at least count 5 or 6 liquor stores, and I don't know why they're there. If we're going to talk about refuge, what does that mean? In terms of accessibility, we have a huge homeless problem. We have a needle problem in Franklin Park, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with bad people. It's just it was the assessment and design of what people thought communities of color or those who lived around Franklin Park actually needed and never asked them until now with this plan. And so I think that the perspective will start to change, but there cannot be a dominant narrative by the oppressor, if you will. There has to be an open conversation about what the oppressed actually need to survive and thrive in the city of Boston. Because knowing our city, we like to be the first, the only, the last, the oldest to do anything. So we have a moment to be innovative. and truly live up to the professed ideals and principles about being a post-racial society. We have a lot of work to do. And I feel like a park, as an example, could actually be a great model to use if we're willing to listen, and not enforce our own uh, uh, elite attitudes about, you know, someone who may look or live differently than us. I don't think that's fair, but I know that's how Boston operates, and it's going to take a big shift in terms of not just the people who suffer, but for those who have the opportunity to change through their privilege and what they can do. But they first have to be willing to make that sacrifice about understanding themselves before anything.
Thanks very much. So I would like to read a quote at this point. This is from Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. My mom is a huge fan, so shout out to her. So the quote is, "If you are a white person who would like to treat Black people as equals in every way, who would like to have a set of associations with Blacks that are as positive as those that you have with whites, it requires more than a simple commitment to equality. It requires that you change your life so that you are exposed to minorities on a regular basis and become comfortable with them and familiar with the best of their culture, so that when you want to meet, hire, date, or talk with a member of a minority, you aren't betrayed by your hesitation and discomfort. Taking rapid cognition seriously, acknowledging the incredible power for good and ill that first impression plays in our lives, requires that we take active steps to manage and control these impressions." So I'm actually going to post a link to a Harvard social psych study and survey that you can all take, and it examines various phenomenon like healthcare, race, gender, and it's a great way for you to really reflect on your own implicit bias that you might not be aware of. And being able to confront that, I think, is a great first step. And yeah, I encourage you all to take a look at that. Anybody have anything to add this time? Good. Okay. So,
Wait. I do.
Sure.
Sorry. I mean, I think that quote is probably the best set of instructions for folks who don't know what to do. And I think to the line about, you know, requires that we take active steps to manage and control those impressions. I think that is probably the most interesting line at the end. You know, cultural appropriation, how things have been done over decades and decades. When you learn about someone that's different from your culture, it is not the moment to impose your own difference. You just need to actually listen, and take whatever notes you can. But with that, with all that information, it is not appropriate to then put out what you think that culture needs. You can't do that. It's like trying to have men speak for women. You can't do it. You know, just you can't do it. You don't live that life. So, you know, when we think about race in this country, when we think about socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, religion, it is just your role to be an active listener and listen for distinction and just for your own individual understanding about that person's lived experience. It is not your responsibility to then try to create an event or program to solve it right now. You just have to learn the information. It's like, you know, all of the emails that are going around or the solidarity statements that are going around about resources. Just read, understand, ask questions, apologize. It is okay, but to enforce your own narrative within the complexities of what is going on is just, please don't do that. That is the worst thing you want to do. You will piss more people off than you think at a faster rate. You just have to listen, and continue to ask questions. And if you get to the point where you're full, great. Now you can download all the information and start anew, because this is about changing behavior and perception to then get to an actual action. And a lot of talking is happening, but is anyone taking notes? Is anyone processing? Is anyone reimagining what our future needs to be versus it being speculative? And I think that's just going to take a greater challenge to overcome.
Thank you very much. So I would like to shift gears, if that's okay with everybody at this point, and talk a little bit about the protests that are going on currently. So as we all know, earlier this month, thousands of Bostonians gathered in Franklin Park to peacefully protest police brutality. So this is a question for everybody on the panel. How else can we use our public green spaces to propel social justice, diversity, and inclusivity?
I can start. So I just think in public health terms, it's been really interesting that these protests are a massive test case in terms of, I don't know, protesting in the time of pandemics as well. And I think the good news is, as far as I've seen, is that in a lot of these protests, the transmission rates have been fairly low. I think around 1%. So the fact that it's outdoors, the fact that most of the protesters, as long as being peaceful, were wearing masks, means that we should just continue to support them, right? And not police them. So I'm not sure what needs to be done differently right now, other than continuing to be open to those forms of demonstrations.
Okay. Anybody have anything to add?
This is Karen again.
Yep, go ahead.
I'm not officially a member of this panel, but I'm just super excited about this conversation. And there's some questions on the chat that at the end I might answer, because they might be a little bit, more technical, et cetera, not necessarily related to the exact topic of this panel. But, I continue to think that the way we make parks, the way we support parks, the way we maintain parks, we either invite or don't invite people in, and we can provide systems that create barriers or create administrative challenges to this is not Boston, this is everywhere. I've worked for New York parks, San Francisco parks, and here, and the fact that we have permitting processes to reserve even a picnic table in some places means that we're creating a hurdle for information, a barrier before how to, you show up with your family, you got a picnic basket, and then somebody else comes and they reserved it months before. So we've created also these landscapes of, prior information, and I don't know if I'm being really clear here, but I think there are ways that we can, interrogate how we manage public open space, so we can make those opportunities more available. But also, I think something about these conversations we're having about, interrogating one's own implicit bias means you need to be out in the parks more, around more people all the time, so you can see, wow, I saw that person walking, and when I saw the person walking with a dog, I thought they were a dog walker. When that person was walking alone, I was afraid of them. Well, what's going on in here? And I think, those are things we have to practice, and I think we become better Americans when we're around more Americans. But I don't know, recent experience would not say that, because I think these things have happened in cities where everyone of all types, all races are already present. So, I'm probably wrong.
Yeah. So I also wanted to add, I think, what we've seen this summer, these past few months have been a tipping point in a lot of respects. And I think something, those of us that care about parks and who uses parks, we need to be aware of how we tip over for a better future instead of a more negative one, and just be aware that, the pandemic has opened up more opportunities for policing, right? And we've seen that it has been, again, unfairly inflicted on Black and brown people in parks, because now there's a new set of rules around the pandemics. We don't even know, how effective they are. And that's why I think it's good to point to the protests, that we actually can probably have more people outside if they're wearing masks. It's not going to spread the pandemic. But we need to interrogate policing practices around so-called safe activities, or leveraging public health, or not confirmed information to push people out of the park as well. And so as these sort of two issues have coincided, hopefully the pandemic is not a time where we continue to discriminate against those communities.
No, I definitely agree with both of you. I think, in terms of, and I just have to pick on Franklin Park because it's the one that I've literally grown up with all my life. And I love all the other parks, but that's just the one that has the most space. So I think the idea of what a park has historically meant to be and what it needs to be redefined as is a huge problem. The idea of a park being a place that convenes, that provides a place of refuge and spiritual connection and exercise and everything else, those aren't always associated with the words or phrase public park. And particularly in Boston, I feel like that has to be redefined now. Especially when you talk about, our city as a whole is designed in a very funky way. We're not on a grid. We're sinking in some places. We got hills in other areas. And so depending on where you are, along Emerald Necklace or any kind of park system, there are different access points and privileges that come with that. And what has been interesting for me is to see how is the definition of or the inclusions of what Franklin Park is capable of doing hasn't been further teased out yet. It's only been known for a handful of things, and to see that many people for protests, it was one of the most proudest moments of, wow, we can do that too? Great, I'm gonna tell a whole bunch of other people, just because we just didn't know we could do that at all. So I think there's this idea of what are the many ways that parks can serve, both in a public health way, but also in a way where different people, to the original point of the park being designed to convene, but with the outcome of changing the narrative for our city and state. I think that's probably the tail end of what is much different than Olmsted at this point. I just feel like the features of a Franklin Park just haven't really been teased out the way that I think it could. And I think it would challenge urban planners and architects and landscape designers about possibility beyond these meetings. It's really, I think, about the idea of what does social connection and human connection really mean in a park like this, or any park along the Emerald Necklace. And I don't think there's been that balance yet.
Yeah, thank you.
I was gonna.
Okay, go ahead.
I one of the things that I think, Sarah, we've talked about, and Catherine, I'm sure we would if we just spent more time together, is that the roadways around the park, which are actually not owned by the city of Boston, but they are state roads, they are so high speed in many places, and they are very formidable. And so I think we have essentially kind of built little walls around the parks that don't welcome, and it was something about, it was also Olmsted's aesthetic. He liked that everything was kind of, lush and kind of hidden, and you would go around a curve and you have like a new, fun thing that be revealed. As a woman, I'm not maybe as charmed by that as an older able-bodied white man, but I understand what he's trying to do. But I think, Franklin Park has gotten some newer entrances recently that say, hello, this is an entrance, but still that's an older park aesthetic. And then there might be a new reality with, especially communicating to new Americans, because there are a lot of sides of the entire Emerald Necklace and part of the Emerald Necklace that I think people don't even know as a park, that because they've been so changed, or look different, or just don't say hello, public park, enjoy. So, you know, and I don't want to make everything cartoony and look like, you know, welcome to Disneyland, but I think that, you know, this is a challenge, because there's also a set of practices in historic preservation that are sort of essentially a set of guidelines that at times can be interpreted to really calcify and, you know, cast in stone everything that was. And landscapes it's challenging to evolve landscapes to respond, because I definitely dealt with this on projects in other cities. And, you know, the Boston has a different and a deeper history than other places. So then, you know, and whose history, right? Whose history, what history? I mean, one history we didn't start with here is we didn't talk about the original peoples that were here before the Emerald Necklace, you know, which is something I would really like to explore in a future webinar, because I think a lot of us don't know that whole history. I certainly know that I don't know it as well as I should. And I'd like to, you know, see, are there ways that maybe even in this Franklin Park conversation, we could sort of see, is there a way to highlight that history? Because I think a lot of people don't know the history and wouldn't learn it, because we don't have a sign that says, you know, find out more here, and you can't write it. It wouldn't even fit. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I had mentioned the example of Seneca Village, which was raised for Central Park earlier in the conversation, and up until, well, actually still now, it's just a small sign in Central Park. You have to look for it, and it's only been this year that they've gotten the money to build a monument for it. So I think there's so much in the erasure. There's, you know, it's as somebody that teaches history and teaches studio, I think it's always a surprise to students that the park didn't just exist that way because it looks quote unquote natural, right? They think it is a piece that's preserved, but it's actually very constructed. So there's no reason that it can't change in the future to reflect, you know, other changes in our constructed built environment and for a more diverse population.
Okay, I think that's it. My last question, I just kind of tying this all together, you know, as we all know, primarily Black and brown neighborhoods such as Mattapan, Hyde Park, and Dorchester have been mostly the most adversely affected by COVID-19. And so with that in mind, how can we list a few ways that our audience could get involved in continuing to support peaceful protests such as the one in Franklin Park, while, you know, ensuring safety and maintaining safe social distancing practices?
And you can donate.
Yes,
You can
you
donate
can.
money from home. You don't have to go out to donate to communities. And I don't know
I mean,
if the other panelists have specific organizations we should be looking to support right now. But
there are a ton. We could be here forever, so we won't do that. I think in terms of actionable steps, you can vote, you can donate, you can petition, you can write a letter, you can make art, you can write a poem. You can even have, if you've never met your next door neighbor, that's probably where you could also start, right? So those are my words of encouragement. As for other ways to support, I think the ongoing and continuation of not just protests, but convenings of people who are dealing with trauma, who are in need of just being heard, not told. You know, there are local churches. There are different artist collectives that are happening. I know that, you know, we have an event tonight after this where we're partnering with the MFA to celebrate Juneteenth. And the goal is for, we have two artists, Dabo Ray and DJ Where's Nasty, to use music as a way to convey what Juneteenth means to them. So they get to choose all the songs, which is kind of cool. You know, there's obviously, you know, different funds to support bailouts for folks who've been marginalized as well. I just feel like in Boston, there's gonna be walks and talking and conversation with our higher education institutions. Financial institutions are now at the helm of, you know, how do we move forward from here? your NAACPs, your urban leagues. I just feel like now is the moment to determine where do you want to give space and time to, and be committed to the journey of that. If it's money, even better. But if it's also, again, just to educate yourself and sit and listen, read, find those resources online. You know, when even there are virtual events happening across everywhere, you can type in eventbrite.com and you can find all kinds of events. To Stephen and Karen, I think for me, I think there's also lists of resources if people are readers. There's tons of online resources and books that people can have, but part of it is that similar to applying for a job, you gotta find everything out about that company. So similar to the issues that are happening, it's up to you to find out the information that you need to make informed decisions about how you wanna move. And that just, it takes preparation, and it takes the will and gut and grit to do that, and be okay with what you don't know and your own fear.
Awesome. Well, I think this would be a great time for us to kind of transition into some questions that the audience has been asking us so far. The first question is there a connection between schools and the necklace? I'd be happy to cover a little bit about that. I'm the youth education coordinator at ENC, along with Kent Jackson, who's the director of education. We have a number of different programs during the school year. I primarily help with the youth leadership program, where I was until the pandemic happened. And that was a really wonderful opportunity because through the city of Boston, youth all around Boston and Boston public schools were able to get to know the history of the necklace and kind of Olmsted's principles, and learn about nature connection and environmental sciences, and connect with professionals in the field and work on career development. The goal of the youth leadership program is to kind of give this base of knowledge about the natural world to these teenagers, and them, they as a team later on become tutors or supervisors for after school programs that are with the Boys and Girls Club around Boston. So we go out and we teach these nature connection lessons, and you know, they get this chance to be role models for these younger kids. And you know, I don't know about you, but when I was a younger kid, of course, I was going to look up to these teenagers, and I want to be just like them. And it's just, I think it is too bad that the pandemic has affected us in this way, but it's a great program that we hope to continue to run the coming school year. Similarly, we also lead, you know, after school programs with the Canopy Classroom, and we have field trips. And so these are for like second and third graders. And it's the chance for them to explore the necklace in these very unique nature connection lessons. We cover topics such as nature journaling, bird watching, and what else? We learn about trees and plant biology and all that kind of stuff. So it's, yeah, there's a whole resource that's outside the classroom in our parks, and we try to take every opportunity we can to kind of expose the youth around Boston to these opportunities. And this summer, I'm really happy to announce that we will be hosting the Green Team program as per usual, but also not really as per usual, because this year, unlike most years, we are accepting 5 times the amount of applicants as there usually are. Usually we have a crew of about 19 or 20. This summer we're looking to host at least 100. And the goal is really just to keep our youth as engaged as possible throughout the summer, and especially in the absence of the usual summer camp programming that are offered. So that's a big project that Kent and I are, you know, trying to tackle right now, and it involves a lot of interviewing and planning, and how can we do this safely remotely. But yeah, that's my answer to that question.
I'm just going to give a little pitch. All the kids are paid. It's a summer job, so it provides some economic support for all the Boston Public School kids that are in the program. It's a job. It's a career development for them. But also, if you know a 19 to 24-year-old that would like a job this summer, there are positions we're still looking to fill that kind of are like junior leaders that would work with Stephen. As long as you live in the city limits of Boston, the city of Boston will hire you to work with us. So pass it on, because we think we can hire up to maybe 8 people.
So Karen, I think you wanted to take one of the next questions. If you want to go ahead.
Which one? Sorry.
It was hang on, I gotta find it again. Sorry.
But I just want to say, I really Stephen has really rolled with the punches, because this education programs have had to change and shift, and I think we're always looking to partner with more schools. The programs are free. We pay the cost. A lot of those programs is the buses. If you're taking kids from the school, so we pay for the buses. It's no cost for 3rd grade classes. It's just about the teachers have so much they have to cover. Like, they're doing a tremendous amount of stuff, so we make lessons that fit the curriculum that the goals the teachers are supposed to make. But we'll have to see how this goes this summer with this year with the pandemic, if we can do that again in the fall. Sorry, I was me filling while you find the question.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So the question was from Stephen Pepper. Can you say anything about proposals to include Columbia Road in the necklace, about the reuse of the Shattuck Hospital property inside Franklin Park?
Well, I bet our panelists could also talk a little bit about Columbia Road and that history. I will just quickly say that Columbia Road was envisioned as part of the Emerald Necklace by Frederick Law Olmsted, that alignment, there was going to be a green, like a parkway that would continue out to what is today Moakley Park, and it was not realized. And now the city has put significant energy into that and some resources. The mayor's budget, I believe, had $10 million last year for that, and they're talking about planning for trying to improve or green those areas, but I don't know the exact plan, but that is a plan. Sarah or Catherine, do you have anything else you would like to add to that? No? Well, I think that's something we should continue to talk about and learn about. It is always complicated to improve existing areas. People are already using them, but those are also some of those areas we've been talking about earlier that have the heat islands. So I think, trees are awesome. Like, let's figure out what can be done. So that's what I know about Columbia Road, and I think that the city is working on that. So I hope that we can start to spread information about that. Hopefully use some of these engagement techniques we've been talking about. And then the second question was about the Shattuck Hospital site. So as many of you may know, the Shattuck Hospital within Franklin Park was built on land that was originally parkland. And then in the 1950s, 1949, 1951, the city provided it to the state for a building of a hospital to treat chronic diseases. And now, about 2 years ago or so, the state notified the city and others in the community that the hospital was beyond its useful life, and they were going to be moving a lot of those services to a facility in the South End. There still were some services they wanted to keep on site, but they were going to be taking the building down and replacing it with a new building because it was too expensive to renovate it. It was better just to build a new building. And so, of course, as park lovers, we're like, interesting. Is there an opportunity to think about more green space? And so, there's been a lot of conversations about that. And I think that's an ongoing conversation. The plan, as it currently exists, does talk about building, I think 175, between 100 and 200 units. I'm not positive of the number off the top of my head, of housing for formerly homeless folks, and with supported services. That I think is part of the proposal on that site, in addition to some other services, and the state is going through a process around that. Been working really closely with the Franklin Park Coalition and other folks to see if there are ways that we can, number one, make the site as integrated as possible into the park, because right now you may see there's barbed wire all around it, and it's very much an island. And I think the state has already incorporated those principles into their plan to make it more integrated. But there also, I think, is a real desire to see if there were other opportunities, other state land beside the park, like the Arborway Yards, for example, where maybe the Shattuck property could be, but then the parkland could be restored. So these are ongoing conversations, and if you are interested in those, please please reach out to us. Catherine or Sarah, are you guys, anything you want to add about the Shattuck, that area?
I mean, just for me, I'm still learning more about it because when I learned about the original design of Franklin Park and that being added on, I thought that was a very fascinating move by the city. And so if there is a moment to reimagine, still providing some services, but also what to do with the square footage of that, I'd be curious, if we could ever move in that direction, just because if the original design never included any of those things and we started to put stuff on it, a moment to, again, change the narrative in the future. And so it's going to be interesting to see that with the community conversations and meetings that are happening virtually, that, I think what I have found is there's all different types of people showing up for Franklin Park in various different ways. But I don't think we all know each other. So to see the folks who are coming to the meetings about Shattuck look very different than the Franklin Park Master Plan. It's very different. And so I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to bring those groups together to learn about where the issues lie across Franklin Park versus just this group over here and this group over here.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts as we think about the continuum of public health and health needs? I mean, there's like the themes are kind of amazing, right?
Yeah, no, it is. I think again, I think the key to thinking about public health, and even though I know that this is the reason for convening here today, is but thinking past the pandemic, so not thinking so specifically, because I will use I'm certain we'll see at future community meetings the pandemic used as a way to say no to many things, right? Whether it's adding gathering spaces in the park, or, as you said, providing more social services in the park. And so I would just say we're definitely in a moment here, but we do have to think past it to more of these long-lasting effects.
Yeah, and I will say that these social services are so needed. There's a serious public health crisis we have, and do not want to minimize the importance or the need for those things. I think Boston, I think handles more than its share of the state, state services here, and I applaud that work. I mean, I think park users, we get it. We clean up the needles. We see the really sad things that are happening, so we get that. And I think it's just about figuring out how we can, make a few goals happen at the same time, hopefully. Stephen, was there any other questions that we wanted to cover?
There's a lot actually, but yeah. So we got time, so that's good. Okay. The next one I kind of want to raise is there's someone who's curious to hear panelists' thoughts on the Charles Gate revitalization project. The question is, how will the project support people experiencing homelessness who will be displaced by the renovation?
So I think that one's for me. Catherine, you and Sarah do not have to respond. So Charles Gate Park, which a lot of people probably don't realize is a park. It's public open space under the Bowker overpass, and it is kind of become what I think people think of as a highway underpass, but it was the original part of the Emerald Necklace. And I think that the point is well taken. There are not every day, but there definitely are homeless individuals, and also a pretty high amount of drug dealing that occurs in that location now. And by bringing new park users, there's a proposal for a dog play area, for a playground. I do think that it is very likely that some of those current users may not be able to would not either feel comfortable staying or would be displaced. And I think it's something we have to think about consciously. I think right now those park users are not given any amenities or safety or comfort. There are no benches, there is no sort of amenity, and right now we are not doing very well by them as well. I think that those kinds of spaces need to be provided, and I have to say I'm very thankful that I've been working with the Charles Gate Alliance, which is the local community group, And there are some really thoughtful members of the neighborhood group that have been very interested in engaging those community members with services, not pushing people out, but really trying to see how we can help this. Because a lot of folks, those are their neighbors. They see them every day, and they actually, many of them know their names. We put out some red chairs last year. We noticed a family that was using them, or regularly, and we became connected to their stories and their history. And so it's not I don't want it to be an us or them. I want it to be a communally important space for everyone. But I think that these are challenges that cities do not do always very well. And so we have to, I think, constantly analyze how we can support all of the users in the space.
Okay, thank you, Karen. This next question might be a little bit more open to everybody. Regarding COG design, I think that's COG design, yeah, is very much in alignment with community-based design, and I hope someone will talk about it for the benefit of the audience.
Sarah, do you know about COG design?
I don't know COG design, but again, I'm new. Still figuring things out in Boston.
So I can tell you what I know, which is that COG design, I'm sure you can find them online, is a group of landscape architects that I believe it's a nonprofit that sort of supports design efforts that communities might interest in changing space, improving space, and sort of use the services of designers to. And I think COG design has kicked off a lot of neat projects that then resulted in great things. I think COG design actually was involved with trying to re-envision Charles Gate 20 years ago when we're not the first ones to like, oh, we should fix up Charles Gate. People have already tried. I hope we succeed this time. So I think that's COG design, and I encourage. I think it's always best when you have a community saying, "Here's what we want. Mm-hmm. Here's what will work." And I think that's a kind of a firm that sort of does that work.
Yeah, maybe I can speak a little bit more broadly about design education, and something that we've been thinking a lot about at Northeastern in the past couple of weeks is, and Karen, you were in design school too, and I think the era where we went to school, we were actually not taught community-based design techniques, right? That you were very much in this culture of sort of top-down design, and as Catherine called out rightfully, that you just, maybe there's an obligatory community meeting that you check off the list, and then you come back with the design and doesn't have much to do with it. And so I'll just say, even though this does not address the question directly, but my colleague Jay Cephas and I at Northeastern University, we are really trying to introduce a curriculum into our studio where we're actually teaching students how to interview, how to listen, how to take notes, how to do research before you interview community members. And so so COG design, if you're listening, I'd love to get in touch after this, because we're trying to bring those skills into architecture school, because they've been and in the practice of landscape architecture, because shockingly they haven't really been taught. Although Karen and I both went to Berkeley, so it was a little bit more present there, but not as integrated as it could be, definitely.
Even Berkeley wasn't perfect.
No, very much not perfect. But it was, I went there for graduate school. I went to undergrad somewhere else, and it didn't even come up. And so I'll just say we're trying to introduce those as skills students in architecture and landscape architecture need, as much as how to draw, right, and how to grade a site for drainage.
I think what you're saying relates back to what Catherine was saying a little bit about listening.
Right.
Because I feel like sometimes I hear someone say, "Oh, we want this," and then if I heard like, "Oh, they want a swing," but then I was like, "Oh, they want, they actually want these kinds of experiences," like, actually listening and being able to like draw out more and understand that it's not just about things, but it's about,
Yeah, and also understand that it's about building relationship. It's about iteration, right? That it's not just like, okay, community meeting, we're gonna check off that. Okay, you have, different groups and talk to different people, and how do you synthesize all of that? And it's a messy process, especially trying to do it in the space of a semester or a year, but it's something that we are really trying to again, introduce within the studio curriculum.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe two more, and then we've got to wrap up, some closing remarks. But one of the questions was, per the points about designers and leaders representing communities, are leaders at the Emerald Necklace diverse enough to represent the needs of the communities they serve? What's being done within the organization to diversify leadership in order to innovate, make the parks better for communities of color?
Yes, I think that's something we all have to ask ourselves. Who are we? Who are we listening to? You know, who make up us? So we have a board of advisors, you know, community organizations that advise us, made up of organizations up and down the necklace. And I don't think it represents right now all of the organizations that could be speaking to us, for us, you know, and be us up and down the necklace. The Franklin Park Coalition is a member, but I think, you know, not everyone has the time to be in our meetings. We meet at certain times in certain places. So I think we have to interrogate how we are generating information and gathering feedback, and then you know, deciding where priorities are. So I don't know that we are. I do not think we are diverse enough. I think that there are ways that we could be connecting more with, you know, I think the Mission Hill neighborhood is not properly represented in our midst. I think that, you know, there are also neighborhoods that are like both physically disconnected, economically disconnected, but also, you know, our relationships are not strong, like Sarah was talking about. So I think that should definitely change. You know, we have to look at the composition of, you know, our staff, our board, and others, and see if there are ways that we can, you know, continue on a trajectory of being better. And listen.
Okay, yeah. Do either of you want to, I mean, I know, do either of you want to weigh in on that? I'd also want to share, Sarah Freeman wanted to mention there's an invitation and request for input next week on the Franklin Park. So there's a public meeting this Wednesday, the 24th, that's going to kind of address the gap in the linear park and the Arborway gap. And yeah, so I'm going to just.
So just to clarify, that is the section of the Emerald Necklace from Jamaica Pond down the Arborway towards the Arboretum. I think it's going to go it's going to talk about the section that goes all the way up to the Forest Hills T. It's probably not going to talk about the final section. It is a big piece that links, of course, the major systems. It's not directly on Franklin Park, so I don't want people to come and then get disappointed we're not talking a lot about Franklin Park. But that is a meeting that is going to be addressing those connectivity and access issues, and talking about those kinds of things. And it's held by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, State of Massachusetts.
I just want to add on something too in terms of diversifying boards and leadership. I think every organization is under scrutiny for that. So, you know, partly the biggest challenge that I would say to ENC and anybody is when I think about history, just in its greater context, in our future, the way that history was taught was very monolithic. It had a certain tone to it. It was very male-centric. And so now history has to be relevant, hip, cool to the specific generations or group of people that you want to see represented on your staff and board. And so the ways in which information is communicated might have to be in animation, might have to be in Braille, might have to be some other visual, might have to be in a song, so that different people can interpret your mission and what you're trying to do with respect to preservation and shifting the narrative around park systems. And I think holistically institutions have really struggled with, it's one thing to write your mission and vision and your business function. It's another thing to try to figure out the many different ways to articulate it to the audiences that you currently serve, but to the future generations who don't know you yet. And that's a legit call to action to institutions that are predominantly white women, white men led, that don't have as many people of color, specifically for communities that they want to affect change with. So I strategically encourage anyone who is trying to figure out what do I do, as a non-PLC person that has an organization that wants to do this change and wants to diversify board. It's one thing to use the general language around what diversity and inclusion is. It's another thing to actually get specific with what that means to you, because that then actually teases out the people you're looking for or who should be looking for you. So I just encourage, to think about strategy and the ways to make your history or the history of your organization broken down a little bit more than what it has typically been articulated in many different forms.
Thanks very much. So before we wrap up the concluding statements, I would just like to share with you all some of our upcoming events, and the links you can find right in the chat box. And just share my screen really quick. So yeah, here is a list of our upcoming events, and we have, everything's cluttered on my screen, sorry. Today, directly after this event at 4, there's the Juneteenth MFA community celebration that Catherine mentioned, and you can find the link at the top. And then on Wednesday, the 24th from 6:30 to 8:30, the DCR public meeting, Arborwood Parkway Improvements Project. Thursday, the 25th, Green Space, White Space, Racial Equity and Public Spaces, which I think Karen's going to be a part of, from what I remember. And
that's a program of the Boston Foundation.
Right. Thank you. And then Studios Without Walls exhibit on the Riverway starts tomorrow, and it will run through September 7th. So be sure to check those out when you have the chance. Do any of our panelists have anything to add on to these events, or anything else we should know about?
Just look forward to Bands Festival 2021 in June.
Yeah.
And if anything, feel free to reach out to us at bandsfest.org to learn more about, the work that we do. We just completed our first strategic plan, so we look forward to rolling out the things we want to do to shift the narrative and ecosystem in Boston, but also with the incorporation of Franklin Park as our major green space to affect social change.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just want to leave us all with a quote to contemplate, and this is by Dr. Beverly Tatum. It says, "I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others." So with that in mind, I'd like to thank my panelists for taking time in their busy schedules to share their ideas with us today. I'm also very, very grateful that so many of you could join our conversation, but please keep in mind that there is still so much work we have to do. We must continue supporting Black Lives Matter so that it does not become another social media trend bound to repeat itself. Even if you aren't Black or do not have a direct connection with the Black Lives Matter movement, you can still have an enormous influence on its outcome. Please remember to continue trying to learn, even though you may never understand, to amplify Black voices, and to continue making our green spaces safe for everyone. All right, thank you, everybody. And yeah, this webinar will be available in a podcast format somewhere down the line.